Hello and welcome to the Career Success Podcast. I'm Jason Connolly. And in this series, we speak to leaders in the world of business and people who've had tremendous career success. We speak to people across a wide range of industries across the globe. We will lead the way in conversation to understand what makes someone successful, the challenges they have overcome, adversities faced, and what success means to them. We will discuss the lessons learned along the way, and myself and my guests will give practical advice on how to grow your business, climb the career ladder, and in the coming episodes, we will speak to many authors of the best-selling business titles. If you are someone who has a passion for business, then this is the podcast for you. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Christopher Bishop from Connecticut in the United States. Christopher is a workplace futurist who has had 8 careers so far, including touring rock musician who played with Robert Palmer, a jingle producer who sang on the first Kit Kat TV commercial, Gimme a Break, and website project manager. He developed Johnson & Johnson's first corporate website. Chris also spent 15 years at IBM in a variety of roles, including business strategy consultant and a communications executive at corporate headquarters, where he drove social media adoption and the use of virtual worlds for training and events. Based on this atypical career path, Chris develops a program on how to succeed at jobs that don't yet exist, designed to give today's learners insight in how to navigate the new world of work. He's shared this perspective at various universities, including Columbia, Duke, Queens College, Stern School of Business at NYU, Texas A&M, and Union College. And Chris has been on a number of seminars and also given a TEDx Times Square talk about this. Chris, thanks very much for joining me on this episode.
Well, thank you, Jason. I'm delighted to be here with you. Look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. So, Chris, first of all, I've been reading through your profile today, and I've had many careers myself. I've worked for an airline, I've been a police officer, but you've had 8 careers so far.
Yeah, it's been interesting for sure. And I would like to qualify sort of the career versus jobs perspective, because I think, again, I'm somewhat, with all lack of modesty, the poster child for the way today's learners, Gen Z learners, even early career millennials are going to work. I mean, this new model that they'll stay somewhere maybe for 18 months or 3 years. You know, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says today's learners are going to have 8 to 10 jobs by the time they're 38. So that's a public sector, not in theory, non-biased organization just laying out the data. And I think it's exciting. I think, again, when I speak to university students, I say, you're going to do stuff that's going to look like magic to me and Jason. So it's going to, get to it.
Well, because I was reading and I was discussing this with some of my colleagues today. Nanopharmacist, lunar tour guide, robotics ethic consultant. I haven't heard of any of these jobs.
Well, to some degree, they're all going on. I cite William Gibson, the famous science fiction author. His famous quote was, "The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed." Right? So there are people, for example, I do some freelance tech PR writing, and I wrote a piece not long ago about something called neural dust, which is this implantable grain of rice-sized device that these 2 doctors at UC Berkeley in California have designed that generates ultrasound. So you can put it into a patient and it will stimulate, say, cells to encourage wound healing or whatever. It will also capture data and transmit it back to the doctor so they can get a sense of what's going on with the patient.
It's really interesting because I guess one thing that kind of springs to my mind is you obviously do these talks at university. Do you think there's going to be more opportunities for the young people of today or less? I guess a really basic example is you go into your supermarket, shop, checkout, people are disappearing. Do you think it's going to, which way do you think it's going to go?
Well, I think there's always, again, at a meta level, I'm quoting famous people that I read and follow. Tim O'Reilly, who's kind of a media mogul, runs big conferences, runs a big tech book publishing firm. His sort of mantra is, as long as there are problems to solve, there'll be jobs. So I think keeping that in mind, there's going to be lots of different kinds of things for today's learners to do. I was on a webinar last week, Bloomberg sponsored it, with a woman who runs, she's like the VP of logistics at DHL, right? Big delivery service
Yeah,
company.
sure.
And she said, they're deploying a lot of robots in their warehouses or whatever, with the 3Ds, dirty, dangerous, and nobody wants to do it. I forgot what the third D is. But anyway, she says, so she has employees and even, mid-career employees who have gone from more hands-on kind of work in a warehouse to becoming robot managers, robot automation managers. So they take the skills they have, how you manage a manufacturing production line, and then learn the skills required to manage a robot and help teach a robot, what to do and what mistakes not to make. And he or she is in a new role.
But surely, I guess the fact that there's more automation means that there is going to be less jobs because someone is, servicing this robot, which is doing the job of however many people.
Well, I think, again, so when I do these university talks, I love to cite Queen Elizabeth I,
Yes.
who famously said at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1589, which is way before the Industrial Revolution, like 200 years before, she refused to issue a patent for an automated knitting machine for fear it would put her poor subjects out of work.
Right. Okay.
Right. So eventually, obviously, in the early 18th century, automated textile manufacturing became, predominant first in England and then all over the world. So instead of running the looms, or doing the actual physical labor, you had people learning how to build the looms, how to repair the looms, how to improve the productivity of the looms, how to come up with new methodologies using existing skills that were transferable and then applying them to this new setting.
So what you're saying is this has been happening way back 100 years. This process has been happening, but jobs have still become available.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an ongoing evolution. I just finished reading this great book by an Economist magazine writer. It's called The Classical School, and if anyone's into economics listening to this, I highly recommend it. It's like the history of classical economics in 20 enlightened lives. And it's just a fantastic story about how perspectives on economics have changed. It used to be that people thought, like in the 17th century, they thought how much arable land a country had determined what their sort of value was in the scheme of things in terms of global economics, right? And then it was the labor theory of value, which was like, well, if it took a lot of people to make it, it must be worth a lot of money. And so anyway, I'll say to your point, these kinds of theories about what delivers value and how economics functions, and ultimately what jobs and careers are available, has been morphing and evolving and changing literally for hundreds of years.
When you do these talks at university, in what kind of context are you delivering this? Is it to talk about the technology, sort of the technological advancement of what's going on in the world around us, or in what kind of angle are you coming at from these talks?
Well, I always start with some kind of social historical perspective, like what I'm describing to you, the Queen Elizabeth conversation. And again, and my admonition to the kids is, okay, take a deep breath, relax. This has been going on. This is not new.
Right.
I mean, again, other fun examples, Plato chasing Socrates around the agora in classical Greece, writing down what Socrates said, and he railed against it, saying, don't write this down, you're going to kill it. I mean, Plato was like, well, people might want to read this later because it's pretty cool stuff, what you're talking about. And some people might say that today about Twitter or Instagram.
It's incredible. So you, just to sort of talk about your career, Chris, because you've done a lot, you've had these 8 careers. How did it kind of all start for you? Because for me, I never went to university. I never followed what is a conventional education route. I went to one of the bottom 5 secondary schools in the UK at the time. So I wasn't particularly myself inspired by education and didn't go down that route. I think I went to the university of life, so to speak. But how did it all start with you? Because obviously you spent 15 years at IBM, and it sounds like you've done a multitude of things. What's been your journey?
Well, again, sort of for context, and I hope this, calms down some of your listeners, but I have a degree from a small liberal arts college in Vermont in German literature.
Right. Okay. And what
That's what I,
interested you about that back then to take that degree? It's a niche.
yeah, it was a narrow niche for sure. I started studying German like in seventh grade
Uh-huh.
and just really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the music. Obviously, I'm a musician.
Hmm.
I enjoyed the culture, the poetry, the literature. And I found it interesting and comparatively easy to kind of figure it out. It's somewhat mathematical, the German language, right? It's
Hmm.
also beautiful in that you can combine words to make a very specific descriptor, right? It gives you the ability to combine sort of nouns and adjectives to be very specific. But I also studied music. And after graduating from college, I got a chance to audition for this touring country rock band. And I got the gig. And 6 months later, I was in Berlin opening for Jeff Beck at the Waldbühne. This is like 1973. So it was, very, nervous. It was dealing with the East Germans was pretty, they were not fooling around. It wasn't a party over there. Um,
Right. Okay. And then
so
you
it,
finished from there. So you spent this time touring around. And how long did you do that?
yeah. So I did that for like 3 years. I did 3 albums with that band. One at the Manor in Oxford, England, Richard Branson's studio.
Right, for
Um,
Virgin Records.
yeah, and then we went to London to mix it at Basing Street, and I ran into Mick Jagger on the way to the men's room. And he was like mixing goat's head soup downstairs. I was doing my record upstairs. He's like, hello, I'm Mick. I said, yeah, I know who you are, man. So the
Fantastic.
band, so we did 3 records. We did one at Electric Ladyland in New York, Hendrix Studio on 8th Street. And we did the third one in Bearsville, where the band and Bob Dylan recorded up in
Mhm.
Woodstock, New York. And then the typical sort of bell curve, the band was unknown, that was popular, then was kind of, couldn't draw enough people to really warrant going on the road. So the band broke up, and I moved to New York to see if I could run with the big dogs, and see if I could actually make a living as a bass player in New York City. And it was, I got my butt kicked several times. I mean, it's New York. It's where, probably the best players on the planet go to make a living.
It's hard to
Um,
get a break, isn't it?
yeah, it was,
In that
it
industry.
was, it was tough. But over the years, I broke in first as a player, and then again, that's where I connected with Robert Palmer. I did 2 tours and a live album at the Dominion Theater in London with him, playing bass and guitar and keyboards and singing. And then came off the road one time and said, how do I sleep in my own bed at night? I'm ready to get off the Holiday Inn, Waffle House dressing room circuit. I asked my friends in the city, and they said, jingles, man, you got to break into the session scene. So I put together a reel, which is like a tape of me playing a bunch of different styles. And this is way before LinkedIn or Facebook. And I used 3x5 index cards and got names and numbers of anyone and everyone in the jingle biz in New York. I mean, starting with musicians and then producers and arrangers and
How did
copyists.
you go about doing that? That's again, it's a niche. You went from touring with Robert Palmer, who sadly passed away in 2003. For anyone that doesn't know him, he did a lot of soulful music. I think he was known for his powerful, distinctive, and gritty kind of voice.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. He was
Okay.
sort of a blue-eyed soul guy. Although we did lots of different styles in that band. I mean, the set was like 23 tunes, and it was everything from techno pop to R&B to kind of blues.
Sounds
It
like
was,
an intense set. 23 songs.
yeah, and one after another. He wasn't into witty banter or filling in the spaces. He was like, next, let's just crank through these tunes, man.
Wow. Okay. So you done that, and then tell us more about this jingle business. So you had these cards. You were going out in New York City.
Yeah, so I eventually, and I say this again to job seekers, right, in the
Yeah.
context of recruitment. I mean, I spoke to probably 100 people, and eventually found one music producer at an advertising agency,
Hmm.
Packer Spielvogel, and they were in the Chrysler Building, which was a cool place to go. And he thought I was cool or whatever, and had an opening and started hiring me to play bass on some of his Miller Genuine Draft Beer commercials. So then I had
Right.
an in. So, and then I had like real jingles I could put on my reel and pitch to other producers. And
Hmm.
eventually, I became like an A-list guy for some producers and a B or C-list guy for other producers. I mean, needless to say, they're incredible musicians in New York. So it's all about relationships. That's sort of the networking concept, right?
Yeah.
Thank goodness for LinkedIn today. I mean, you can do it all with a couple of keystrokes, whereas I have these 3x5. I still have the box of cards, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, my wife found them in the basement like a year ago or something. But so, and then the Jingle Biz, I actually got my first job at age 40 because
Right. Okay.
even the Jingle Biz became a bit of like, trepidatious because if I couldn't do the date, they would just hire the next bass player on the list. So it's like, I've got to move up the value chain. And again, I would say this to your listeners. You don't want to be the guy in the rhythm section. You want to be the guy behind the glass producing the date or writing the tune. In this case,
controlling it, and I think we'll talk about that in the sort of latter half of this episode about your advice. And there's a lot to be said about people who bounce from one career to another career and have career changes, and how do they do that. And we'll kind of talk about that because I think that's really relevant, especially for this career success podcast. So it sounds like a journey. So where did you go then from? Did you get up the food chain of the jingle business?
Well, I did. So I approached this guy that I'd done some dates for, some recording sessions for,
Sure.
right? His name was Lee Shapiro. He'd been the musical director for the Four Seasons. Remember that band?
Yeah,
Another like 80s band.
I've got varied music taste, Chris.
Yeah, oh, good. So he had set up his own, what they call a jingle house, which means you rent space in a office building in New York and you set up a recording studio and you hire a rep and you solicit work from ad agencies. So I said to him, Lee, I want to get off the studio scene and get into a production role. Plus he had a synclavier, which probably your listeners don't know about, but that was the state-of-the-art digital musical instrument at the time.
Right.
It cost like $250,000, so needless to say, I couldn't buy one. But
Wow.
he had made some money and he bought one. And what it did is it captured timbres, musical instrument sounds digitally at 100K in stereo, so they sounded really great. And you could summon these timbres to the keyboard and record them all digitally and then manipulate them as data. And this is like 1980. So I went to work for this guy in 1990, and it was still sort of the state of the art before MIDI and sampling and sequencing really took over the music scene. I always say in about 1985 in New York, music became data.
Right, okay.
Right, meaning you could capture sound and store it as information, bits and bytes on, at the time, like a Winchester hard drive was this giant device at 512K, and you slid it into this rack. I mean, it was really primitive.
It sounds like you've always been on the cutting edge and the forefront of technology, whether it's in the music business or your time, spent in IBM, or even the talks you do now.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely, and that's a good sort of sidebar, just to again orient to your point, to orient our listeners. One of my main mantras in these workshops that I do is, and I wrote a piece on LinkedIn. I would encourage listeners to check it out. First of all, connect with me on LinkedIn, and then I put up a post. And I call it Chase the Maelstrom, Find the Chaos, Go for the Mayhem.
Tell us more about that.
So by that, I mean, go where they don't know what it is yet in terms of looking for a job.
Yeah.
And again, it's at the intersection of unlikely disciplines like nanopharmacy, which is the intersection of mechanical engineering at the nanoscale and developing pharmacology at the atomic or molecular level. So that's new stuff. Nobody's really done that before. And that's just an example of the kinds of things that are happening. So the way I sort of did a clear example for me was I saw the World Wide Web appearing in the early 90s. It was like, this wacky new internet thing. And my thought was, well, maybe they'll have music actually, but also at a meta level, it's probably going to have sort of global sociocultural and even business impact. So let me investigate this and see how I can contribute or participate. And I taught myself to be a web producer. I left the jingle business, read a lot of books, went to a lot of classes in New York, stayed up late surfing the web, looking at source code, and eventually left the jingle business and hung out a shingle as a web producer and got some freelance work. And then a headhunter found me and I got hired at an agency in New York as a web producer in like 1995.
At the very early days of the World Wide Web.
Yeah. And to be fair, it's not because I was brilliant or good looking, although, that probably helped. But the idea is that I had a skill that was in demand. And again, I say this to your listeners. get skills that are in demand based on where businesses are changing and evolving and
But
trending.
was you at that age? Was that kind of a conscious thing that you were doing in order to? I need to get this skill because I see this is becoming, popular. It's taking off. Was that conscious, or was that just more of an interest?
No, it was a very conscious decision. Again, like my move into the
Mm.
jingle biz, working at a jingle house, because I saw that the role for electric bass players in New York was going away. It was, and again, I back to historical precedents. I often cite the example of Henry Ford rolling out Model Ts off his assembly line in 1908 in Detroit. All right,
Yeah.
any color you want as long as it's black. Um, and there were a lot of panicked farriers and blacksmiths going, "Holy cow, what am I going to do now?" And the reaction from the culture for the business world would be, "Well, those are really great skills, but we just don't need many people who know how to do that anymore." So,
Right. So it's kind of
and
the
I
skill expired. So
the
you
skill expired
right.
exactly, and that's how I felt as an electric bass player in New York in about 1985. Like
Mm.
that's a really great skill, but we're just going to sample your timbre and put it on a hard drive and summon it to the keyboard whenever we need it, and you don't have to show up. See
It's
ya.
really interesting because your career and the way it's kind of evolved and what you've done, it's actually been driven by the skill set that's in demand at the time.
Yes, absolutely. Recognizing trending, right? And again, I encourage listeners to put on those kind of glasses. Look ahead. Again, go where they don't know what it is. Like where is the new stuff? So, and I would say,
Mm.
again, some categories might include, and this is just some examples
Yeah,
of say technologies or business models that I'm interested in. Certainly would include artificial intelligence, obviously,
yeah.
which is the new electricity, right? It's everywhere, impacting everything one way or another.
Mm.
Certainly robotics, the application of things like telehealth to medicine, and again, back to the nano devices that are being created, looking at blockchain, looking at crypto assets, not just cryptocurrency, but other ways to capture and distribute and store
Mm.
value, right? And I've recently gotten very into quantum information science. So
Right. Because
that's an
I
area.
can't say I know what that is.
Well, well, it's sort of three sort of meta categories. Quantum computing, which
Right.
gets the most attention, right? Which is using what are called qubits to capture, manipulate information.
Yes.
IBM has several cloud-based quantum computers that you can use. You can rent
Uh-huh.
and use to solve problems.
But
Quantum networks is another area, and quantum sensors as well.
really interesting. I think that it sounds to me like you're very future thinking. You're always someone that's trying to spot trends to understand, what the future's going to be. Obviously, you've had an extensive career, but we do have a lot of people who listen to this show who are maybe just starting out in the world. They might be at university, they might be a graduate. And to bring it back to current day, it's a scary world out there at the moment. There's with COVID, with even with the way universities are not able to have seminars. But you've kind of touched on it there in regards to some of the advice you would give to people. I personally believe that skill set is really important, and I talk about this often at universities and at different seminars and conferences myself. Transferable skills are so important. What you've mentioned though is kind of really particular skill sets in terms of the future and stuff like that. But what would you say to maybe someone that's kind of just starting out in life? They're just at school, they're just at college, they're maybe thinking about university. What would you say to them? Because you've had, career has been extensive.
Yeah. Well, so at the risk of sounding salesy, I
Oh,
have
well, you go. You. This is your platform, Chris. You tell.
okay. I recorded a live action course for LinkedIn Learning, and it's called Future Proofing Your Data Science Career. Right. So they asked me to sort of focus in on the data science discipline, if you will. But again, I would say to your listeners, this future career toolkit is the core of it. And when I do these workshops at universities, I take students through these, what I call my three tools, future career tools, right?
Mhm.
And just quickly, they are voice, antenna, and mesh. And the voice exercise uses an ideation technique where I ask you to conjure your favorite movie, TV show, book, even game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what aspect of that trigger resonates with you to help you determine sort of what your brand is, right? So, for example, for me, right, my favorite recent movie is Blade Runner 2049.
Right. Okay.
I saw that movie like 3 times in 3 different settings, 3D and IMAX and a regular
Wow, a
screen.
true fan.
Yeah, but I'm intrigued by sort of future culture and future technology. So that's sort of my focus here, my brand, if you will, on some level. Right?
Yeah.
The second exercise is the tool is called Antenna, and in this tool you build a grid looking for where conversations around those triggers are going on.
Right.
Right. So for me, I watch BBC Click, which is a weekly TV show about sort of leading edge technology and how it's being
It's
applied
great.
in,
Yeah,
right?
I'm a fan of that too.
Yeah, I love that show, right? There's a show, Bloomberg Technology, that's on every day. That's sort of like a love fest with Silicon Valley. It's
Mm.
sort of like Entertainment Tonight, but with like executives at startups. But they talk about who's doing what, where, what kind of innovative technologies are driving business models. So those are a couple of the antenna. And one of the things I ask people to do, students to do, is put down some temporal guidance, some longitudinal parameters, like how often are you going to check this? And a lot of times that's dictated by, how often this stuff is published. So Click is on once a week and Bloomberg Technology is every day. But
Hmm.
to make sort of a discipline, make a regimen, a schema around it, right?
Yeah.
So, and then the third tool is Mesh. And I think of that as like a 3D data visualization exercise. And the idea is look at your network of networks and try to build it out. Find people, actual real people at companies and organizations based on the antenna findings that are doing stuff that's interesting, and then connect with them.
It
So
sounds to me like quite a complicated formula, but if I was going on the LinkedIn channel, is it quite simple for someone to understand? Is that to me
yeah,
it sounds complicated?
that's sort of like finding your brand, finding the
Yeah.
people talking about what topics relate to your brand, and then
Uh-huh.
connecting with those people so they know who you are. Get on their proverbial radar. So
Right. I think building your brand is so important, and no matter what industry you do, I don't
yeah,
think it's enough now just to be good, a good employee or someone that's skilled. I think it's about selling yourself, and throughout my career in recruitment, it's always been about building a brand, building something that's visible. And the power of LinkedIn now is, and I'm learning new stuff about LinkedIn all the time, the algorithm, the way it works, the way it pushes things out, the way things trend. And I talk a lot to lawyers about how to build your personal brand. Law is an area which is still fairly draconian. Yes, they've caught up, but it's still behind. It's way behind finance. It still is quite backwards.
yeah.
What advice would you give? We're sort of fastly moving to the end of this episode, Chris. I could talk to you all day long. You're so interesting. But what advice would you give to someone who's maybe interviewing, going out there into the big wide world? You've interviewed for a lot of roles. You've really sold yourself well. What advice would you give to someone who's going for an interview, preparing for perhaps the next new modern job?
Well, so again, quoting people who've influenced me or who I learned from.
Yes.
Um, I was at an event at LinkedIn headquarters in Sunnyvale, California,
Yeah.
and their vice president of global talent acquisition, Brendan Brown, wonderful guy, got up, and his opening remarks to this group of about several hundred like senior HR people was, just for context, he said, "The war for talent is over. Talent has won." And his,
Oh,
and his take is, I mean, certainly not in every situation in every company, but the idea is you, listeners to this podcast and or learners entering the field or figuring out what to study, keep in mind that you want to interview the company as well, right? So
yeah.
you have skills that they need, and the right company will recognize that. I always used to query sort of hiring managers about the appetite for innovation. Like, what are you prepared to, where are you prepared to push the envelope? Like,
Yeah.
and ideally come in with ideas. Say, I looked at your website or I read your annual report or I saw your recent blog and I thought it was interesting, but here's what I think you might do to change or improve or modify. Or have you thought about this topic or this collaboration or this kind of interaction or this kind of technology implementation? and
I
see
think
what
that's
they say.
really interesting. It's interesting, and I think interviewing now it's changing. It is a two-way street, and I think it's about having that open conversation about. And I think it's advice I give to people. Go and show a real interest in that business. It's really relevant.
Yeah, and how you would transform it or enhance
Yeah.
it or modify it or, add additional relationships or expand the supply chain or the ecosystem that they're working in. Because again, I think of, Laszlo Bach, he was the chief people officer at Google. He wrote a really great book called Work Rules. But
Uh-huh.
there's an interview with him, interviewed Laszlo Bach in the New York Times a couple of years ago. And again, I'm encouraged. But one of the things that Laszlo Bach said, how do they hire Googlers? And he said, well, for one thing, we don't look at like standardized test scores or GPA or whatever. He said they don't tell us anything we need to know.
Yeah.
We want to know if people can connect dots in unusual and interesting ways,
Uh-huh.
if they can conjure a strategy and articulate it in front of the group and or acquiesce when someone else has a better idea, if they can be an emergent leader and sort of take ownership of their own failures or successes, not say, the reason the project succeeded is because it was my great idea, or the reason it failed is because Cloud blew it and nothing to do with me. So, I mean, the idea is, well, it's a collaborative effort, everyone working toward end of job, toward a common goal.
So it sounds to me like you're a believer in kind of psychometric testing, personality profiling, in that kind of interviewing technique as well, in order to find the right person for the job.
Well, yeah, I think you want to make sure that you represent your brand, back to the brand discussion, right? Who
Sure.
you are, what's important to you, and values, right? So the common knowledge is that many millennials won't work at a company, say, with a poor corporate social responsibility record, or
Yeah.
one that isn't focused on sustainability, or that they'll work for less money at another company where the company's perspective aligns with their values and worldview. So,
Right. Okay. And lastly, Chris, if you had to say what your hot job of the future is to be in the forefront of people's minds, what would you say that is over the next 5 to 10 years?
well, I'd say there are going to be lots of transformations going on, many driven by the COVID-19
Mm,
situation, right? So, incredible advances in drug discovery and drug development, for example, vaccines and cures, right?
sure.
So if you're interested in that space, I'd certainly go for it. I would say if I had to pick one thing, I would
I put
say,
you on the spot, I know,
yeah,
Chris.
no, it's good. No, it's good. I'd say quantum information science. While I think most people's perspective is that you need to be like a particle physicist to play in that space or get a
Yeah.
job there. Again, as with any innovative technology, there's a whole portfolio of adjacent and ancillary businesses that go on that support this technology. So by that, I mean, someone's going to have to deal with microfabrication. Who's building the dilution refrigerators at mini Kelvin that these qubits are operating in? And at another level, like who's writing the comms and marketing doggerel for these things? Like who's going to explain in common language how this stuff works and what the business value is?
Well, it's certainly not going to be me, Chris, that's for sure. Listen, it's been absolutely lovely to talk to you. Really interesting. Could talk to you all evening.
Thank you.
Chris, if people want to find out more information about you, they want to connect with you, where can they go to?
I certainly encourage them to reach for me on LinkedIn. I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn. I accept pretty much all invitations to connect, so you can certainly find me there. I have a website called improvisingcareers.com, where I sort of, my ideas around workshops are posted. There's a cool travel log where I used to keep track and take pictures of all the different events where I taught or spoke. That's kind of fun. But probably LinkedIn is about, I also tweet. I have a Twitter account, and yeah.
Great. Okay, so if you want to connect with Chris and you want to find out more about how to succeed at jobs that don't yet exist, visit him on improvisingcareers.com or look him up, Christopher Bishop, on LinkedIn. Chris, thanks so much for joining me on this episode today. It's been a delight to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason. I enjoyed it.
That's it for another episode of the Career Success Podcast. Join me on another episode where we'll be talking to leaders and well-known authors in the world of business.